Every single day in America, more than 130 people make the most permanent decision of their lives. They leave behind shattered families, unanswered questions, and a grief so profound it can destroy everyone left behind. But what if the most terrifying question isn't what happens to those left behind? What if the most terrifying question is what happens to the ones who leave? Edgar Cayce, the most documented psychic in American history, a man whose medical readings were so accurate they baffled Johns Hopkins physicians and left scientists speechless, spent decades channeling information from what he called the universal consciousness about exactly this question. And what he revealed will shatter everything you think you know about death, judgment, and the soul's journey after suicide. Picture this moment. It's 1933 in Virginia Beach, Virginia. A desperate woman sits across from Edgar Cayce, tears streaming down her face, clutching a handkerchief worn thin from weeks of grieving. Her son took his own life 3 months ago. She needs to know, not wants to know, needs to know with every fiber of her being whether her child is suffering, whether he's condemned, whether she'll ever see him again. Cayce closes his eyes, loosens his tie, folds his hands on his chest, and enters the deep trance state that had already produced over 10,000 documented readings. What comes out of his mouth in the next 20 minutes will give this mother something that neither her priest, her doctor, nor her grief counselor could provide. A detailed, systematic, and profoundly compassionate account of exactly what happens to a soul that chooses to end its own physical existence. What Cayce described wasn't the hellfire and eternal damnation that her Catholic upbringing had terrified her with, but it also wasn't the peaceful immediate release that modern spiritual platitudes often suggest. What Cayce revealed was something far more nuanced, far more just, and far more aligned with a universe governed by love rather than punishment, yet still carrying consequences so significant that understanding them transforms how we think about life, death, consciousness, and the purpose of human suffering itself. Here's what will absolutely stop you in your tracks. Edgar Cayce gave over 14,000 documented readings during his lifetime, covering everything from past lives to medical diagnoses to global prophecies. Many of his medical readings described diseases and treatments that weren't medically accepted until decades after he gave them. His accuracy rate in medical readings was documented at over 80% by skeptical physicians who studied his cases. When a man with this track record of verifiable accuracy turned his attention to the question of what happens to suicides in the afterlife, the answers he gave deserve serious, careful consideration, not as religious dogma, but as one of the most detailed and internally consistent descriptions of post-mortem consciousness ever recorded. What if I told you that Edgar Cayce's readings reveal that the universe operates not on punishment and judgment, but on something far more precise and ultimately more hopeful? The principle that consciousness creates its own reality, both in life and in death. That what happens to a soul after suicide depends not on an external judge, but on the soul's own state of awareness, its reasons for choosing to leave, and the universal laws of growth and learning that govern all conscious experience throughout eternity. This is Edgar Cayce's profound and compassionate exploration of one of humanity's most painful questions, a journey into the metaphysics of suicide and the afterlife that reveals a universe operating according to principles of love, growth, and inevitable healing that transcend death itself and offer hope to everyone who has ever lost someone to this most devastating of choices. Before we explore Edgar Cayce's detailed revelations about what happens to souls after suicide and why his readings suggest a universe far more compassionate and just than either religious condemnation or spiritual bypassing can capture, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because what you're about to hear might bring healing to wounds you didn't even know you were still carrying. Edgar Cayce's framework for understanding what happens after death begins with a foundational principle that runs through all 14,000 of his readings. The soul is eternal, indestructible, and on an evolutionary journey that no single lifetime and no single decision within that lifetime can permanently derail. Cayce described the soul as a spark of divine consciousness that incarnates repeatedly in physical form to learn specific lessons, develop particular qualities, and ultimately return to conscious union with what he called the universal consciousness, or God. This framework is crucial for understanding his perspective on suicide because it means that death, by any means, isn't an ending, but a transition. The soul doesn't cease to exist after physical death. It continues in a non-physical state of consciousness that Cayce described in remarkable detail across hundreds of readings. The question then becomes not whether the soul survives suicide, but what kind of survival, in what condition, and with what consequences. Cayce's readings consistently described the immediate aftermath of death as a period of awakening to the soul's true nature and condition. He explained that for most people, the transition from physical to non-physical existence involves a gradual recognition of one's own state of consciousness, a kind of spiritual inventory where the soul becomes aware of the thoughts, emotions, motivations, and spiritual development it carries from physical life. For souls who die by suicide, Cayce described this awakening process as particularly significant because of what he called the law of consciousness continuity. The principle is both simple and profound. You don't leave your problems behind when you leave your body. The emotional pain, the depression, the despair, the trauma, these are conditions of consciousness, not conditions of the body. When the soul transitions without the body, it carries its consciousness exactly as it was at the moment of death. Think about this with the depth it deserves. If someone ends their life because of overwhelming emotional pain, they cross into the non-physical realm carrying that same overwhelming emotional pain, but now without even the limited tools that physical existence provides for processing it. The body, Cayce suggested, actually serves as a kind of buffer and processing mechanism for consciousness. Remove the body, and the consciousness is left in a more raw, unfiltered state than it would be in physical life. Recent research in consciousness studies has explored how emotional states can persist beyond what we understand as normal processing boundaries, suggesting that Cayce's description of consciousness continuity might reflect genuine principles about how awareness operates. While modern science hasn't confirmed afterlife states, the concept that consciousness creates its own experiential reality aligns with emerging theories in quantum consciousness research. Let me be clear about something essential that Cayce emphasized repeatedly in his readings. This is not punishment. The universe, according to Cayce's consistent teaching, does not punish. What follows suicide isn't divine retribution. It's simply the natural consequence of the soul's own state of consciousness operating in an environment where that consciousness is fully exposed without physical mediation. Cayce described several distinct categories of experience that souls might have after suicide, and these categories depended heavily on the circumstances, motivations, and consciousness state that accompanied the final choice. His readings revealed a universe of extraordinary nuance that refuses to apply a single blanket judgment to an incredibly diverse range of human experiences. The first category Cayce described involved what he called confusion states, souls who transition so suddenly or while in such an altered state of consciousness that they don't immediately understand they have died. These souls, Cayce explained, often continue attempting to engage with the physical world, not understanding why no one can hear or see them. They remain attached to the physical realm through the emotional bonds of their final moments. Cayce's readings about these confused souls are among the most poignant in his entire catalogue. He described them as lost rather than condemned, searching for understanding, seeking connection, often desperately trying to communicate with loved ones they left behind. These souls, he suggested, might remain in this confused state for what corresponds to significant periods of time, unable to move forward in their spiritual journey because they haven't yet achieved the awareness necessary to do so. Recent accounts from near-death experiences reported by people who attempted suicide and survived contain descriptions that align remarkably with Cayce's readings. Many describe encountering what they understood as souls who seemed lost or confused, as well as experiencing their own consciousness as completely intact and continuous with their pre-death state, exactly as Cayce described. The second category in Cayce's framework involved souls who transition with full awareness and clear consciousness despite their choice. These might include individuals facing terminal illness, unbearable physical suffering, or other circumstances where the decision represented a clear-minded assessment rather than a crisis of mental illness. For these souls, Cayce suggested the transition could be much more peaceful, though still carrying the responsibility of understanding why the choice was made and what learning was interrupted or avoided. Cayce was clear that interrupting a physical incarnation before its natural completion creates what he described as spiritual debts, not in a punitive sense, but in the sense that the learning the soul intended to accomplish in that lifetime remains unfinished. This unfinished business, according to his readings, must eventually be addressed, either in the non-physical state or in subsequent incarnations. Think about this concept like leaving a university course before completing it. You can leave, and leaving is your choice, but the material you were enrolled to learn doesn't disappear from your curriculum. It waits for you, patiently and without judgment, until you're ready to engage with it again. The universe, according to Cayce, operates with this kind of patient, persistent commitment to each soul's growth. The third and perhaps most discussed category in Cayce's readings involves souls who transition through suicide while in states of severe mental illness, profound depression, or other conditions that significantly compromise their capacity for clear, conscious choice. For these souls, Cayce's readings were notably compassionate and direct. The degree of responsibility is proportional to the degree of freedom and clarity available in the moment of choice. Cayce repeatedly emphasized that the universe understands the difference between a soul making a free choice and a soul whose capacity for choice has been overwhelmed by illness, trauma, or other forces beyond their control. His readings described these souls as receiving what he called special care and attention in the non-physical realm, helped by more advanced souls and healing influences that assist in gradually restoring clarity and peace. Recent advances in neuroscience have confirmed what Cayce described in his readings decades before modern brain science existed. Severe depression, suicidal ideation, and certain psychiatric conditions involve neurological changes that genuinely compromise the brain's decision-making capacity. The scientific documentation of these biological constraints supports Cayce's metaphysical claim that these souls experienced genuinely diminished freedom of choice. Cayce's description of the healing process after suicide is where his readings become most distinctive and most hopeful. He described the non-physical realm as containing what he called rest periods and healing opportunities, states of consciousness where souls can process their experiences, receive assistance from other beings, and gradually achieve the clarity and peace that eluded them in physical life. He was explicit that no soul is permanently lost, permanently condemned, or permanently separated from divine love. The universe's fundamental nature in Cayce's consistent teaching is love, not the sentimental variety, but the fierce, patient, unconditional love that never gives up on any soul, regardless of what choices they made in any given lifetime. Recent compilations of near-death experience research have revealed that people who survive suicide attempts frequently describe their experiences as profoundly transformative, often encountering not judgment or punishment, but a review of their life that included experiencing the pain they caused others alongside the pain they suffered themselves. This life review process aligns precisely with Cayce's description of the soul's awakening to its own state and the consequences of its choices. But Cayce's readings also contained important warnings that went beyond individual fate to address collective impact. He described how a soul's transition by suicide creates what he called karmic ripples, not as punishment, but as the natural propagation of consciousness through the interconnected web of souls who are connected through love, relationship, and shared purpose. The grief, trauma, and spiritual questioning experienced by those left behind after suicide, Cayce suggested, isn't just human suffering, it's part of the collective karma of that soul group, experiences that will need to be understood, processed, and potentially balanced across multiple lifetimes. This isn't presented as punishment for survivors, but as an honest accounting of how deeply our choices affect the souls we're connected to throughout eternity. Think of this like dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripples aren't punishments imposed from outside. They're the natural consequence of introducing a sudden change into a system of relationships. Every person touched by those ripples is affected according to their own relationship to the original disturbance, and the healing of those ripples is part of the collective spiritual work of that soul group. Cayce's readings also address the question that haunts so many survivors. Can they communicate with a loved one who died by suicide? His responses were characteristically nuanced. Yes, communication is possible, but its character depends on the consciousness state of the departed soul. A soul in confusion cannot provide clear communication. A soul in the healing process might be able to convey feelings of love and recognition. A soul that has achieved greater clarity after processing their transition might be able to communicate more specifically and helpfully. He cautioned strongly against attempts to compel or force such communication through certain spiritual practices, not because communication itself is dangerous, but because forcing connection with the soul still in a confused or painful state can delay their healing process by anchoring them to the physical realm when what they need is to move forward. Recent research in grief psychology has documented how the specific grief associated with suicide loss carries unique characteristics, including complicated grief, survivor's guilt, and a particular quality of unresolved questioning that align with Cayce's description of the karmic and consciousness dynamics following suicide. The psychological reality of suicide grief seems to reflect the metaphysical principles Cayce described. Cayce also addressed the question of whether suicide can ever be spiritually justified, a question he approached with characteristic directness and compassion. His readings suggested that the universe recognizes genuine moral complexity in certain extreme circumstances, and that rigid absolute rules fail to capture the nuance of individual situations. However, he consistently maintained that the general principle favors completing the physical incarnation because of the unique learning opportunities physical existence provides. The physical body and physical life in Cayce's framework aren't prisons or punishments, but extraordinary opportunities. The friction, challenge, suffering, and beauty of physical existence create conditions for consciousness development that aren't available in non-physical states. Choosing to leave prematurely, regardless of circumstances, means choosing a less efficient path to the growth the soul needs, though never an impossible or permanently blocked one. His readings described specific advice for souls considering suicide that sounds remarkably like modern therapeutic counsel. Reach out, seek connection, allow others to help carry the burden, and trust that the darkest periods of physical existence often precede the most significant breakthroughs in spiritual development. Cayce suggested that many souls who most desperately want to leave physical existence are actually on the verge of their most important spiritual breakthroughs, that the intensity of their suffering reflects the magnitude of the transformation available to them if they can endure through it. Recent research in post-traumatic growth has documented that many individuals who survived suicide attempts and received appropriate support described their subsequent lives as profoundly meaningful and transformed in ways they couldn't have imagined during their crisis. This empirical pattern of potential transformation aligns with Cayce's metaphysical description of the breakthroughs available just beyond the darkest moments. Edgar Cayce's ultimate message about suicide and the afterlife refuses both the cruelty of eternal condemnation and the spiritual bypassing of easy reassurance. His readings present a universe of extraordinary love, patience, and justice, where every soul is held in perfect care, where nothing is permanently lost, where healing is always possible, and where the consequences of our choices, however painful, ultimately serve the purpose of consciousness evolution that no soul can permanently escape. The next time you or someone you love is touched by the devastating reality of suicide, whether as a survivor, a grieving family member, or someone struggling with their own darkness, remember Edgar Cayce's carefully documented insights about the universe's response. Not judgment, not condemnation, not eternal punishment, but a loving, patient cosmic system that meets each soul exactly where it is and works with infinite patience to bring it home. If this exploration of Edgar Cayce's profound and compassionate teachings about what happens to suicides in the afterlife has brought you some measure of understanding, healing, or hope, please reach out to the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988 if you or someone you know is struggling. Smash that like button to support more explorations into the deepest questions of consciousness and existence. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our journeys into the frontiers where metaphysics meets modern understanding of consciousness and healing. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that the universe's response to our darkest moments is not judgment, but love. And let me know in the comments, how have Cayce's teachings changed your understanding of what happens after death? What other aspects of his readings about the afterlife would you like to explore? Drop your thoughts below and join our community as we continue to explore the extraordinary intersections between ancient wisdom, modern science, and the eternal questions about the nature of consciousness, death, and what lies beyond.